Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around right before the end panel. I am thrilled to be in Dublin. Last time I was here was actually to ring in the year 2000. And there is a story involving Heineken, Japanese tourists, and Shania Twain in a pub. I can tell you about that later. I am excited to share some with you today, and being in the position of hearing so many great speakers through the morning, I've actually prepared my presentation to try and weave together the threads that I knew you were going to be hearing today. Once you get my presentation up, let me know so that I can pop through that. I don't want to give Ralph's again. Although Ralph did have alliteration, we learned that that's important for branding today. I will have some alliteration myself in my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and once the slides get up, I'll be able to catch up there. Just a little bit about me in terms of an introduction. My title is Sonic Strategy Director. There we go. When people hear that title, two things usually happen. The first thing is, pretty cool title. I think so. Then the second thing that I usually hear is, but what the hell do you do? So, what is sonic strategy? The pithiest way I've come up with describing it is to say, I'm in the business of taking a bit of sound science, blending that with sound art in order to help folks make sound decisions. See what I did there? So that's a little bit of my day-to-day job that usually involves one of three things. Working with our clients. I do a lot of work in sonic identity and marketing, just how clients are using sound to get their ideas about their brands across and to sell their products. But then I also dabble in a world I call sonic experiences. That's kind of moving beyond the traditional advertising platforms and starting to get into how we might use sound to excite and engage consumers in different ways. An example of that was last year. I played hip-hop music to cheese for 6 months while it aged to see if I could change its molecular structure. And we actually did. We changed the aroma and the flavor of the cheese. Cheez-It used this sonically aged cheese to create special limited edition boxes of Cheez-It. We had a hip-hop playlist that people could access on Pandora. They sold the boxes out in about 12 days and had a lot of earned media. Those are the fun kid in the sandbox things for me that I love. And the last area that I play in is an area I call sonic interventions, where we kind of look at common good or cultural or societal issues where sound might be a solution. So all of these things involve my day-to-day work and get me in working with brands and trying to elevate audio and how they use audio. So in the presentation that I have for you, I want to talk to you a little bit about how, to me, this is really go time for audio. If you look at what happened during the pandemic, we saw this rise even more in audio consumption. I mean, when we look at the US, we find that 31% of the media time in the US is spent on audio channels. Interestingly enough, though, only 8.8% of media budgets are devoted to audio. In fact, we found that roughly 25% of brands don't even show up there. And that's a real opportunity cost. This guy, Rory Sutherland, talked about opportunity costs as something where if you're completely unwilling to embrace the uncertain, you will never pursue any incremental opportunity at all. So why is this? Why do people not think more about using audio in advertising, and why do they not see that that's a potential opportunity cost for them? As we've already seen today, in all of the presentations, audio is so effective in so many ways. This guy is Miles Davis. I love jazz, if you couldn't tell by the hat. One of my favorite Miles Davis quotes is this: when someone asked him how he knew what to play, Miles said, "Man, I don't play what's there. I play what's not there." To me, this is creativity. And I think this is something that gets lost in the data. Now, I'm a science guy. I love data. I also love this guy, who we've talked about today, Les Binet, who I like to think of as the jazz cat of the econometric set. And Les, as we've already heard from some of his other quotes through the presentations today, talks a lot about creativity and the fact that creativity is really going to amplify your media spend. It can stretch those media dollars even further. And so I think when it comes to looking at data and the observations here, as important as the data is, I think sometimes we need to learn how to play what's not there. And that's what creativity is all about. I think sometimes we get so concerned with best practices that we forget about next practices. And that brings me to this guy, C.K. Pravlod, who is the father, if you will, of next practice ideas. And he talked about the fact that if we concentrate on best practices, there's kind of a competitive convergence that happens. And CK said that what we really should be doing is thinking about what's coming next. You only want to pay attention to the weight of the past, but if we think about the push of the present and the pull of the future, where does that take us? It's kind of a disciplined imagination. So I want to take you on a little journey with me, because it's go time, and because I like alliteration. We're going to run through a few go things. So the first one is to go deep. We've talked about this a lot today, looking at the science behind audio and how it impacts our brains and our physiology, all of the little neurochemicals, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the things that are happening in our physiology when we hear sound, how all of that begins to pull into our emotions, and how audio is a huge emotional driver. That combination of physiology and emotion creates memory structures in our mind that are hugely powerful. But it's not just memory. Sound affects our perception of the world around us. We know that we can change your perception of what you're seeing just by changing the soundtrack behind it. I did some neuro research where simply by changing the piece of music under a commercial, we changed where you looked on the screen, how long you looked at certain things, and how you saw the narrative or interpreted the narrative of what you were seeing. That comes to this idea of meaning and semiotics, that there are symbols in the sounds. And you combine all of this, and we know that audio impacts our behavior. How long we spend in a supermarket, how much we eat in a restaurant, what we pull off of a shelf, depending on what we're hearing, and how advertisements affect us emotionally. So when we're thinking about going deep, I'd suggest maybe you think about some sonic KPIs. There's a word we haven't heard yet today. We got KPIs for everything. Why not KPIs for audio? So I encourage my clients to think about what's your KPI for engagement. And engagement's really a bullshit metric if you don't have a behavioral outcome attached to it. So for every sonic choice that you make, what's the behavior you're trying to drive? And will that choice get you there? And then think about your identity. Ralph spent a time in his presentation doing a great job of talking to us about sound in the context of brand identity. What's the perception of your brand where you're trying to meet consumers there? That's really what you're trying to do, is just align brand intent with consumer perception. Because as we all know, brand isn't what I tell you it is, it's what you perceive it to be. So what's that use of sound going to buy me for that brand perception? And then finally, when we think about equity and growing equity, how are we using sound to build brand equity? And that's all about management. That's about consistency. That's about building these memory structures. That's going deep. But we also need to go long. And you've heard a lot about that today. Les Binet and Peter Field did some classic research looking at sales activation or short-term messaging versus long-term brand building. And what they found, looking at about 1,000 ads in the econometric data over 30 years, was that short-term performance-based marketing actually works. You see the uptick in sales. Usually lasts about 6 months till you hit again with another direct ad. But they found that brands that concentrated on long-term brand building, while they didn't see the sales lift in the beginning, over time, these brands generated twice the revenue. Now, what does that mean sonically? Well, you've already heard examples today of ads that were wall-to-wall VO, that were a little bit more than an oral version of direct mail. And we should be thinking about the power of audio, how it affects us, and how we can use it to build brands. Now, a note of caution here. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use audio for short-term advertising, because it works, but you need to have a balance. And what Peter and Les found was that for most brands, it was a 60-40 split. 60% concentrating on building the brand, 40% on this short-term activation. So it's a bit of both. And as Andrew pointed out, talking about Orlando Wood's work, there's a couple ways that our brain is interacting with what we hear and how it impacts us. And thinking about what you're trying to do with your advertising. Is it about targeting? Is it about information? Is it about physical availability? Or are you working for broad reach, emotion, or mental availability? Again, we should be doing both, but concentrating on how we're building the brand. And then the marketing funnel. That's something else we haven't seen today. But what's a presentation about marketing without the funnel? Does anybody know how long this has actually been in existence? Well, this year is the 100th year anniversary of when the funnel first appeared in print. 100 years. And the problem is, we're still looking at it this way when we know now from the neuroscience data, a lot of that you've heard today, we need to think about re-envisioning this. And Tom Roach has done that, so I'm going to give you his framework because I think it's quite good. If you want to learn more about it, you can Google Tom Roach funnel and cockroach. Make sure you put cockroach in there. But Tom says at the top of the funnel, we need to think about this as building. It's not just awareness, it's building memory structures. And once we have those structures in place, what we need to be doing is continually nudging these associations. It's part of what helps bring it top of mind. And when we get to the lower part of the funnel, it's not conversion, it's really connecting, making sure that consumers know how to get to the product, that it's there, that we can connect. And why is it important to look at the funnel this way? Well, by the time we get to the lower part of the funnel, the reality is 90% of consumers have already made up their mind. And if you're only advertising to those consumers that are ready to buy, that's only 5% of your market. Again, why this idea of brand building is really important and going long is so important. Let's think about going wide. Well, what does that mean? When we think about audio advertising, very often we think about the channels that we would use traditionally to advertise a product. And why I think it's important to break some of these channels out is this idea of optimization that we've talked about today. You heard Ralph talking about the difference between a leaned-in situation, an advertisement in a podcast, versus a leaned-back situation, which just may be happening when someone has the radio or a streaming service on in the background. The kind of ads that you would put in those contexts should be very different. But let's step back even further. There's an entire universe where you can touch consumers' ears. So when we think about what we're doing with audio in radio, we should also be thinking about how that connects with audio in TV, how that connects with audio in a retail environment, how that might connect with audio that the product makes when you use it, how it connects with what you hear when, God forbid, you get put on hold. I mean, I can tell you stories of brands that spent a lot of time and have been really consistent in their advertising with sound, but if you get put on hold, you're in an entirely different audio universe that takes you out of that brand structure. So the consistency across all of these channels is really important. So when you think about sonic identity, we should really be thinking about the sonic experience of our brands, whenever, wherever, and however they're heard. And when you're talking about sonic identity, it's a process. I would encourage any of the brands that are thinking about it to work with a sonic agency that knows how to do this really well. But I'm going to give you 6 parameters that are measurable that you can apply right now to thinking about your sonic decisions. The first is congruency. So thinking about how well the sounds you are choosing are congruent with your brand values, your brand personality, and also other elements of your brand design. The colors, the shapes, all of these things can be communicated with sound as well. So making sure that your choices are congruent. Then they need to be memorable. That word memory, you've heard it time and time and time again. Finding something that's easy to stick in your mind. Melodies do that really well. That's why a lot of sonic identities are based on little melodies or brand anthems, brand themes. Then it needs to be distinct. Now, part of that is in how you are creating and developing these assets. But the other part of it is how consistently you're using it time and time again in all of these other channels. And then there's flexibility. Ralph did a great job of showing you different ways that these little motifs and themes could appear as a sonic logo or as a brand anthem, translated into different emotional contexts to be optimized for different ads. If I go, ba-dum-bum-bum-bum, I'm loving it. I can sing that, or I could play it on a tuba. I don't play tuba, but I do play guitar. I could play it on a guitar, or I could play it on a keyboard, and you would recognize it because it's extremely flexible and adaptable. Then it also needs to be appealing and likable. And finally, it needs to be ownable. And by that I mean not just owning the sonic space that you hear it in, but ownable in terms of the copyrights and the trademarks, because these are intangible assets that for a brand you can ultimately collateralize. You can even collect royalties on it and offset the cost of that development. So these 6 parameters are measurable, and they're a really important part of building a sonic identity. So what about going further? This is a place where I think we can move beyond thinking about audio as an audio-only use and thinking about it as an audio-first use. And by that I mean how we can think about developing ideas and campaigns in ways that center around audio, but aren't just dependent on the audio channels. One of these things is a world I call sonic tonics, kind of going back to the Go Deep piece, where we were thinking about the impact on our physiology and our psychology. And there's lots of ways that healthcare brands or hospitality brands can lean into the power of sound to help us focus or relax or rejuvenate or be mindful or more healthy. I've done a lot of research in this world of sonic seasoning with Charles Spence at Oxford University. And this is the idea that I can actually change your your perception of flavor, not just by what I'm putting in your mouth, but what I'm putting in your ears. I've done a lot of work with Cadbury and Chivas and Propel and other brands where we've played with flavor profiles and changing your perception of a piece of chocolate as being more bitter or more sweet. So we can use sonic seasonings in interesting ways to bring these kinds of brands to life. And then there's the idea of sonic diversity. You know, when we talk about diversity in advertising, we're often focused on what we see. But in an audio world, diversity is also about what we hear. So how are we thinking about diversity in the context of our audio advertising? The voices that we're hearing, and what are they communicating to us, and what are they communicating about the brand? And I would argue that we need to be careful with segmentation, because if the only time we hear certain voices is in ads that are segmented for those populations, then we've not simply segmented our advertising, we've segregated it. And then finally, this is something that, interestingly enough, we haven't heard a lot about today: AI. Moving into a world of sonic synthesis, and what does that mean? I'm fascinated with the application of AI in operations and creative workflows, but as a behavioral science fan, I'm also interested in the implications. So I've spent the past couple of years looking specifically at AI and creative workflows, and some research into how we hear human versus synthetic voices. And there's a lot of interest in synthetic voices and how we can use them in advertising and in audio. And I think the jury's still out. Any of you that want to talk more about this, I'm happy to share more later. But the one thing we need to be careful with right now is bias. Everything we're finding in our research is that there's a bias against AI voices, or maybe for human voices, even though we may not always be able to tell the difference. But as soon as you let consumers know that they're hearing a synthetic voice, we find implicit attraction is going down. And we may enter a world where regulation is going to say that we have to disclose. So before you go too far down that road, think about some of these implications. So in wrapping up, sending you forth today, remember, when you're thinking about audio, make sure you're going deep, going long, going wide, and going further. And when it comes to sonic strategy, remember, it doesn't start with your ears, it starts with what's between them. Thank you, and there's all my contact info.